Hello and welcome to ChatDPS. This week we are bundling in towards Christmas, the end of the year, and things are really heating up. So last week saw everybody join the Security Edge Adept Conference down in Melbourne, and there were some really interesting panel discussions that went on there. The first and foremost, though, is that what they're saying is that there are some critical things that need to be sorted out before we enter into 2020. So the first one of those is MFA. And what they're saying is that they're reframing this whole thing around, MFA as a fraud control, not an IT chore, which is kind of an interesting reframe. And it's an interesting way to actually start getting people thinking a little bit differently about things. They talked about ransomware, and what they're basically saying there is that it pays because the basics are failing. Yeah. And backups that never been restored at high speed are, in their terms, theoretical. I was particularly interested, and I'd like to be able to do a little bit more research to find out who actually used this word, because a great song by Marillion back in the days, Fugazi, they were saying, which is of course a word that means bogus or false, making bogus or false claims around the theoretical ability to upgrade your backups quickly. Frequent practice. Who's doing this? That's a particularly good question. Gen AI came under the focus as well. And what they're suggesting here is that it's scaling faster than our guardrails can log the usage, categorizing data, restricting sensitive questions, transition to a paid model, they're suggesting. And then finally, there's third-party data flows beat policy binders every single time. So this panel advocated for visibility. They wanted to map out where your workers and consumer data are actually moving, and include basic controls. Robert, there were a few things that really do sort of like take some scrutiny, and the ability for running a no notice restore of your top 3 services. They want to understand the time it took to fix and what fails. Yeah. So this is kind of an interesting one for organizations that are not running drills all of the time. What are the things they should be looking out for?
So unfortunately, Adam's is still traveling. But so if we took some of those points that you mentioned, so I think that the last one you mentioned was about doing no notice impacts to your top 3 services, which I take to be some kind of almost like a false restart or something, to kind of test the resilience of those particular services. Sounds like a really good idea. I mean, the more testing and preparation you do, the better it is. So I think the key thing for me, the key thing that kind of stood out when I sort of read that as a suggestion was, I better not do that on production. So I'm sure that's not the case. When it comes to doing something like this, you want to be able to set up some sort of non-prod environment. The closer you can get a non-prod environment to prod, the better value you'll get out of any sort of testing. It's never going to quite duplicate prod, but hopefully there will still be some learnings you can actually sort of see in terms of when you sort of force shut down a particular service and try and start that back up again. What do you learn from that in terms of, what are some of those issues as that service restores? What can you learn from that? How can you make sure that if that actually happened on prod, you'd be able to get in there and try and resolve that more quickly? Yeah, that's certainly, as I say, it's always worthwhile testing as much as you can.
Yeah, I mean, as part of a crisis plan, I mean, you actually genuinely need to know how long these things take, right? I mean, and it's not just that, but what are you actually restoring, and in what
Yeah,
time frame? All of the other bits
yeah.
and pieces that go with it. I mean, this is about a crisis, and that's a significant piece. I mean, I would like to go back to the MFA question though, and that one in particular, which was suggesting it's a fraud control, not an IT chore, which is, I think, a really interesting reframe of the fact that, hey, look, it's an IT chore at the moment. You've got to go through it in order to be able to do
Yeah,
your work. But
yeah,
what's
yeah.
responsible? What's responsible?
And this would be a good point to get Adam in here and have a chat to him about it and get his views. But anyway, so you're just stuck with us. But it's an interesting kind of reframing to think about MFA and those sorts of pass keys and that sort of thing as a fraud control, as opposed to ticking a box. Making it a sort of core part of what you do as IT operations. It'd be interesting to get a sort of CISO side view of, if you reframed it that way as a fraud control, would that attract more funding from, the decision makers within the organization, CIO, the board, whoever it might be? Because I think they suggested, you should fund MFA passkeys in the way you would a fraud control. And obviously there's a lot of investment that goes into fraud controls for those organizations that take that seriously. Whether reframing it would have that same sort of effect, don't know. Be interested to get other views on that. Maybe that's something we can pick up with Adam's back.
Yeah, there was another action, I mean, fairly significant one, actually, in my view, which was the fact that they want people within the organization to actually frame or publish a one-page AI acceptable use policy, move the staff to an approved tool. So they're suggesting the paid tool quite clearly, so that it actually keeps the data that's being utilized confidential, I suppose, to some respects. In some it does, in some it doesn't. So therefore, that's the whole point about having an approved tool, is it not?
Yeah, so I guess this is like trying to get some kind of basic AI controls in place. And I think it's something we've touched on before. I think it's a good idea to get something in place if you've got nothing. But I think when you look at the use of AI, you've got to be methodical about this. And they're sort of suggesting, and you touched on this point, that the way these AI tools are evolving is at a much faster pace than the guardrails you can put on them. So you really need to be thinking about governance in a very kind of measured and methodical way. Why do I need this tool? What impact is it going to have on the business? Do your risk assessments. Think about change management. Think about training. Think about running a small trial. Don't go big bang. Test those results. Validate that the business case is actually realized. If you put this in properly, make sure you do have your policies and procedures in place. Monitor them, audit them, do all these sorts of things. So yeah, absolutely. If you've got nothing for 2026, get something in. Get at least like they say, a one pager in. But really, if you are using AI tools, you've got to be much more methodical in terms of how you implement them.
Yeah, and then moving on to the next recommendation, which was around list your top 10 suppliers by blast radius and confirm contacts and test one drill, your policy test. So this is like I'm guessing, Robert, like a desktop incident review type thing.
Uh-huh.
And the importance of this cannot be stressed enough. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Again, it's that theme that we just touched on. Test, test, test. Prepare as much as you can, so that when these things come up, you kind of know where to go. You're following your incident response plan. You've got all your contact lists. You know what the steps are. And so, I mean, I think there's a tendency for those organizations that I'm aware of anyway that do a desktop review is to keep it internal. So consider internal stakeholders and get them to participate, as opposed to and look, they may talk about third parties within that kind of internal organization, but they don't necessarily bring in their third party suppliers into that tabletop exercise. So I think that's a really good point that's made, is that you actually bring a supplier, some of your suppliers in. Now, I know there's a lot of effort involved in doing that, but again, if you're able to bring that third party in or third parties in, and you can actually hand off to them in the room, online, whatever it might be, with the next step of an incident response to some sort of crisis. It's a great way of figuring out whether the incident response plan, the crisis management plan, holds up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole point about having a crisis management plan is the fact that it's inclusive. And I think one of the things that for me is the fact that if you're being inclusive through that period, then it actually gives your suppliers confidence. We talk about supply chain risk all the time, but if you're not talking to your suppliers or the supply chain itself, then what hope have you got, sort of like when it all comes out of the blue one day, when you've got some stranger on the phone and it's sort of like, oh yeah, well, I'm managing this, it's what the,
It's
anyway.
a key part of risk management, and you can't just rely on the contract you've got with that supplier. You really need to be from an IT perspective, from a data perspective, governance perspective, whatever it might be, you need to actually be making sure that that risk is managed appropriately, and testing that relationship, testing their own controls that they say they have as part of a wider incident is vital.
Yeah, playing the playbook, I mean, it's sort of making sure that you've got the connections, the contacts correct,
Yes,
all that information. Because if it
absolutely.
comes down to the day, you don't even know what the regulator's number is, we're in big trouble, right? So, I mean, that's going to
Correct.
be a big thing.
Yeah.
The last point that was made was around build a phoner cyber friend. I love this one. I thought it was fantastic. And again, really sad that Adam's not here because this is something that I'm sure that he would have absolutely loved to have gotten under the skin of. But network of 3 peer CISOs. Now, I don't think it should be just CISOs. I think it should be much broader than that. I think you should have, as many different execs, that you can get to the table. Trade mobiles, get chat groups going, and actually use them. It's saying.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I think it's a good way of keeping yourself on top of what's happening in the industry. If you have some sort of group, which I'm not saying share confidential information, but if you have some sort of, Chatham House rules applying or something where you can kind of go, hey, we had this situation that we did X, and maybe you can kind of bounce a few ideas off some of those peers as well, just to kind of see how other people are handling some of the threats out there. So I think there's strength in sharing information, sharing ideas, and yeah, I agree. If you can broaden that to broaden that to other experts, and learn from other perspectives, really good kind of idea to think about for implementing next year.
Yeah, and I think I suppose the big thing that we didn't talk about today was the fact that some of the empirical evidence that sort of like sits down around this is the fact that the reason for getting guardrails around things like AI early is because when 52% is a number that we've been given by a recent poll of US executives that thought it was perfectly acceptable to put corporate information into a an AI engine just to find out they could do their work for them quicker, more efficient, and all the other bits and pieces. Then quite clearly we've got industries that are crying out for some sort of guidance around what to do and how to do it, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think there's a real kind of momentum to get an AI tool in and get it working, and start to try and reduce effort wherever it might be without, like I say, without thinking things through. And then you end up like Deloitte. So you don't want to do that. You want to be implementing these things in a thorough, risk-based way. And I think there's such a sort of stampede to do everything AI that people are just not really thinking these things through properly, and we see some of these consequences.
Robert, thank you. That was ChatDPS for this week, and we're looking forward to the next one. I think it's coming a lot quicker than we think. Anyway, my friend, take care.
Thanks, Nick.